Thank you very much, Valia. It was very interesting indeed. And I think in what you end, this might be the beginning of the general discussion later on. And now, please, I'm calling to the podium Professor Asher Shassar. He's from the Department of Middle Eastern and African History at Tel Aviv University, and he will talk about historical narratives and the issue of trust.
Good afternoon. First of all, my apologies for not being here for a number of the sessions. I unfortunately have teaching obligations which clashed with other sessions, so the fact that I wasn't here was not out of any lack of interest, quite the opposite. Speaking last, I think leaves me with not that much to say that hasn't already been said. But I will try to make a connection that perhaps hasn't been made, and that is this issue of narratives and trust. There clearly is a link between the narratives and the trust. I think it's a huge mistake to bring the narratives into the negotiation. The narratives should be discussed somewhere else. This place, the Faculty of Humanities at Tel Aviv University, is a good place to discuss narratives. We do it all the time. It's part of the School of History. That's the place to do it. Bringing narratives into the negotiation is a terrible mistake. I think it has exacerbated the problem of trust that existed anyway because of the narratives. I'm not sure that the narratives were brought into the negotiation out of any deliberate design. We ended up there, and I will try and explain how we got there. But I think where we are at the present juncture, where Israel requires of the Palestinians to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, is asking of the Palestinians to renegotiate their historical narrative. It's something that they will not do, just as much as the Israelis won't renegotiate theirs. And asking people to negotiate their narratives is asking for the impossible. People don't do that. Narratives are not created, whether they are narratives or meta-narratives, however we wish to explain them, are not created in order to be negotiated. And bringing them into the sphere of the negotiation, I think, is a terrible mistake. And the sooner people walk away from that, perhaps, the better. How have the narratives that Israelis and Palestinians have about the conflict, how have these impacted upon particularly the Israeli-Palestinian dimension of the conflict? And as I will show, Israel-Palestine is not the same as Israel-Egypt. The interstate conflict between Israel and the Arab states is very different from the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Particularly on these issues of narratives and trust and what is at stake in the minds of the people. The conflicting narratives are very well known, but I will nevertheless state a few points from each of the narratives in order to emphasize what I think at present is the unbridgeable abyss that separates them. These narratives are not just slightly different. They don't differ on this or that point. They completely conflict with each other. Zionism for the Jews is the ultimate act of self-defense against their awful historical fate. For the Palestinians, Zionism from day one is net aggression. For the one side, the ultimate self-defense and the ultimate historical justice is for the other side the ultimate aggression and the ultimate injustice. They are not just slightly different. They don't live in the same ballpark. Israel has been victorious in its great effort to defy Jewish history. 1948, the greatest victory of the Jews in 2,000 years, resulting in Jewish sovereignty and statehood, and absolutely literally rising from the ashes of horrendous destruction just 3 years before. As the Israelis say in their narrative, Mishoah letkuma, from the Holocaust to revival, that is the story in a nutshell, that the great majority of Israeli Jews believe to their very innermost being. This is national liberation and justice for the most oppressed of all peoples. For the Palestinians, this is the Nakba, the great catastrophe, traumatic defeat, the loss of homeland. What is Palestinianness? Palestinianness, as opposed to every single other territorial identity in the Arab world, such as Egyptianness or Jordanianness. The Egyptians and the Jordanians, the Tunisians and the Moroccans can all identify as such with the territory which they inhabit. The Palestinians identify with the territory that they lost, which is unique. It makes them very different to all the other Arabs. It is their uniqueness. That is what is unique about them. What makes Palestinian is defeat and the loss and refugeedom. And Bishara Dumani, who is an American Palestinian historian, says it as follows: the shared memories of the traumatic uprooting of their society and the experience of being dispossessed, displaced and stateless were to come to define Palestinianness, the great historical injustice. But if that is so, and indeed it is, the Palestinians seek to turn the clock of history back. And the question is, back to where? Back to 67? Or back to 1948? How far back exactly must the clock be turned back? So the Israelis come with this question of, Israelis would say, trust. What are the intentions of the Palestinians? Is it turning the clock back to 1967? Or is it turning the clock back to 1948? And thus the Israelis, because of this fear of how far back in history we are going in this process, the Israelis are, as a result, completely consumed and preoccupied with security. From fences, checkpoints, occupation to its nuclear capability. For the Arabs, this Israeli obsession with security fences, checkpoints and nuclear capability is all about Israel's hegemonic design. It's not peace that you people want. You want domination. You Israelis and your security requirements, in Arabic they say, this is akaliyat al-ikhtilal. You people cannot get rid of your occupation mentality. You want to get out, but you want to stay in at the same time. You have a mentality of occupiers and you cannot rid yourselves of it. You want out, but you want to remain in. And thus we come to the key differences between the interstate and the Israeli-Palestinian. In the interstate conflict, there is one set of issues which we can call the 1967 file. Israel occupied territories of the neighboring Arab states in 1967. Israel can give back these territories and end the conflict. We did it with Egypt, we did it with Jordan, we were nearly there with Syria, it was touch and go. With the Palestinians, however, there are two sets of issues. There is the 1967 file, which is the easy stuff, just the West Bank and Gaza, and then the 1948 file. The entire peace process is based on a resolution called Resolution 242, which you all know very well, which is inherently deficient. It doesn't deal with 1948. Resolution 242, which is the entire foundation of the peace process, deals only with the 1967 questions. The resolution was born in November 1967. The word Palestine, Palestinian, doesn't even appear in the resolution even once. There is a minor reference which comes after the freedom of navigation. Very interesting, the order of priorities here. The refugee question. And it says there must be a just solution to the refugee question. It doesn't say which refugees. It could be the Jewish refugees from Iraq. It doesn't say the 1948 refugees. It doesn't say the 1967 refugees. It doesn't mention who these refugees are. The word Palestine isn't there. And as a result, the PLO always objected to any peace process that was founded just on Resolution 242, because 242 entirely ignores the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 242 was designed to solve an interstate conflict. It wasn't designed to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The interstate element of 242 that relates to the West Bank was supposed to be between Israel and Jordan. The Palestinians are not part of the agenda in November 1967. And I jump from there to what I call the Oslo Dynamic. What is the Oslo Dynamic? The Oslo Dynamic, on the surface, seems to be going along with 242 and reducing the question of Palestine to the West Bank and Gaza. Not all of Palestine. Why does the Oslo Dynamic appear to be doing that? Because the Oslo Dynamic created the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority, for all practical purposes, has essentially succeeded and replaced the PLO, although formally it hasn't. But in practice it has. This is a dramatic political evolution of the Palestinian question, which I think the great majority of Israelis don't notice, and should. The Oslo process established the institutions of the Palestinian Authority, the presidency and the parliament. Elected institutions. Who elects these people? Who elects the president of Palestine? Who elects the parliament of Palestine? Only the people of the West Bank and Gaza. Not all the Palestinian people who the PLO used to represent, wherever they may be. And therefore the representative institutions of the Palestinian Authority essentially represent a reduction of the issue of Palestine to the West Bank and Gaza. An acceptance, it would seem, of the two-state solution as this moment of finality. And Israel sought to end the conflict on that basis. Israel sought to obtain from the Palestinians a declaration of the end of conflict, the end of claims on the basis of the 67 file of the West Bank and Gaza. There was to be a trade-off in the Israeli mind. The trade-off would be Israel will concede on much, not all, but on much of the 1967 file in exchange for closure by the Palestinians of the 1948 file. And this is exactly what Camp David failed to do. Israel, first of all, did not offer a complete withdrawal from all of the 67 territories. And when the Palestinians required of Israel to return to the 67 boundaries, the Israeli argument was, and this shows how very different the points of departure are, the Israeli argument was, how can you ask for all of the West Bank? Why don't you compromise? We can't do this all-or-nothing style of negotiation. To which the Palestinians say, excuse me, but you guys have got 78% of the territory already. We're only negotiating about the 22% that remain of historical Palestine. And it's on that 22% that remain that you're arguing about all or nothing. But what this shows is that the Palestinians came to the negotiating table starting from 1948, whereas the Israelis come to the negotiating table starting from 1967. They are not talking about the same thing. And when the Israelis discovered that the Palestinians would not accept this trade-off of 1967 for 1948, then the Israelis seek to establish some kind of cast iron barrier, such as the recognition of Israel as the state of the Jewish people between 1948 and 1967. Israel seeks to take the Palestinian refugee question, that is Resolution 194 from 1948, and to subordinate it to Resolution 242. That is, return will be to the territories of 242, that is to the West Bank and Gaza. Whereas from the Palestinian point of view, because 242 is inherently deficient, it's not 194 subsumed in 242, but 242 plus 194. So there must be a state in the West Bank and Gaza and some element to be defined of implementation of 194, that is return to Israel proper. Both sides accept two states. Two states for the two peoples, both sides accept. But if you look into the nitty-gritty of the acceptance of both sides, both of them have important components of their understanding of two states which intrude into the territory of the other guy's country. They both have what I call an intrusive acceptance of two states. The Palestinian intrusion is with refugees. There must be some element of return to Israel. How defined exactly was never ever agreed, of course. And where the Palestinians had very firm disagreement with the so-called Clinton parameters, Clinton's summary after Camp David was on this refugee issue, where the main complaint of Arafat and Fatah, generally speaking, was that for the Palestinians on refugees there must be a freedom of choice. It cannot be Israel who decides how many Palestinians return to Israel. You guys, the Israelis, you are responsible for the refugee problem. You threw the refugees out. It is not your right to decide who of them comes back. You must accept the right of return, and the right of return means that we, the Palestinians, must freely decide who of us returns. It's not your choice, it's our choice. Whereas the Israelis say we're a sovereign state, and the state of Israel will decide who comes into Israel's boundaries and how many. 10,000, 15,000, 5,000, 100,000, whatever. It's Israel's sovereign decision. And there never has been an agreement on that. And the Israelis, therefore, because of this protrusion into Israel on the refugee question, Israel has demands of the Palestinians on both of these questions, on narrative and security. The demand that Israel has on narrative is that the Palestinians must recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. This is the iron wall between 1948 and 1967. That is, if the Palestinians recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, there won't be refugee return to Israel. And it comes from the understanding after Camp David that there is no neat trade-off, as the Israelis wanted, of 67 in exchange for closure on 1948. Why is this recognition unacceptable to the Palestinians? Why don't the Palestinians accept the idea that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people? Why don't they just go along and say yes? There are two main reasons. The first, and I would say the most predominant, for the Palestinians to recognize that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people is to recognize that historically Palestine is Jewish. And they're not going to do that. They're not going to do so, by the way, any more than the people who demanded the Palestinians to recognize Israel as such would recognize Palestine as Arab. And the second point is the question of the status of the Palestinian minority who are citizens of Israel. The argument is that if they recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, they may be giving some kind of legitimization or justification to people on the Israeli right who would like to disenfranchise, or worse, to the Palestinian citizens of Israel. There was a brief mention of the talks between Olmert and Abu Mazen. There was a great deal, or not a great deal, but there was progress made on all fronts in this negotiation. The gaps narrowed down both on issues of territory in the West Bank and and in Jerusalem as well. But on the refugee question, positions were actually, one could even say, progressively worse. Olmert offered the return of 5,000 refugees to Israel proper, 1,000 a year for 5 years. The Palestinian demand that was made in the talks was somewhere between 100 to 150,000. That was leaked by WikiLeaks, the 100 to 150,000, and immediately denied by the Palestinians. So even though the number that was suggested by the Palestinians was 20 to 30 times more than what the Israelis were offering, when it was made public, this was denied, and there has been a serious problem when coming to any kind of understanding of the numbers involved. How does the Israeli intrusion into Palestine take place? The Israeli intrusion into Palestine is through security. Israel has security requirements, as we have heard, and we still hear about the Jordan Valley and other security zones. Israel must control the airspace of Palestine. Israel must control the border crossings. And as a result, you have this shared concept of two states for the two peoples, and both sides accept it. But the manner in which either side accepts the two states is one that, as I say, intrudes into the sovereign territory of the other in their very basic understanding. And therefore I will simply conclude with what I think is the obvious conclusion, and that is there was a principle in this negotiation which I think has been extremely damaging. And the principle in this negotiation was that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Well, that is a way of ensuring that nothing will ever be agreed. There are certain things that are not going to be agreed anytime soon, particularly this refugee question. And I'm not talking about the rights and wrongs of it. One could argue about the rights and wrongs of it from now until the end of time. But there will be no agreement on the refugee question anytime soon. And if we continue with this principle that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, nothing will be agreed. So we have to get off, I think, that high horse if we want to make progress. And the other is narratives and peacemaking. They don't bond. And the place for the discussion of narratives, as I said, is the classroom and not the negotiating table. Thank you.